He thought the silk meant she would stay, but that was the night Naomi Brooks finally learned that love could die in perfect lighting. The Manhattan skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Callaway penthouse, a field of gold and silver scattered across the dark like a promise the city no longer intended to keep. Inside, everything was beautiful in the precise, expensive way Ethan Callaway preferred. The black marble floors reflected the chandelier light like still water. White orchids rested in low crystal bowls. A fire moved quietly behind smoked glass, more for atmosphere than warmth. Naomi stood in the center of it all wearing the pale midnight blue nightdress Ethan had once told her was his favorite, not because it was dramatic, but because it made her look like peace. Tonight, she had chosen it for that exact reason. Peace, or at least the memory of it. On the dining table near the window, dinner sat untouched beneath silver covers, the sea base cooling beside roasted asparagus and a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet that had already breathed too long. She had lit candles an hour ago. Now their flames had grown smaller, softer, as if even they were tired of waiting. Naomi glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. Ethan was nearly 3 hours late. Again, her fingers tightened around the folded note in her hand, then loosened. She had rewritten it twice. The first version sounded too emotional. The second sounded like a legal memo. The one she held now was simple, measured, honest. We need to talk about what happened to us. Not the schedule, not the shareholders, not the interviews. Us. She had practiced saying the words out loud, quietly, into the mirror while the city turned from dusk to night behind her. She did not want to fight. She did not want a confession dragged out of him like a tax audit. She wanted one thing only: the truth, spoken without polish. There had been signs, of course. There were always signs. The late meetings that arrived with no calendar entry. The calls he started taking on the terrace, voice lowered to a register that did not belong to business. The sudden distance in a man who used to reach for her hand. Without thinking, Ethan had once filled every room he entered with certainty, and Naomi had loved that about him. But now his certainty felt colder, sharpened into something that left no room for tenderness. Still, a small, stubborn part of her had held on. Marriage, she had believed, was not measured by perfect weeks. It was measured by what remained when life lost its shine. The soft chime of the private elevator cut through the silence at exactly 11:52. Naomi lifted her head. Her heart did not race. That surprised her most. It simply steadied, as if some deeper part of her had already crossed into a place the rest of her had not yet named. The elevator doors slid open, and Ethan stepped into the penthouse wearing a charcoal overcoat over his tailored suit. One hand on his phone, his expression composed in that familiar, devastating way that had once looked like strength and now looked like distance. He didn't see the candles first. He didn't see the dinner. He didn't even see the note in her hand. His eyes landed on Naomi, on the silk, on the waiting, and for a fraction of a second something unreadable passed across his face before it disappeared behind the same cool perfection he offered boardrooms, cameras, and men who feared him. That was when Naomi understood the most dangerous thing in the room was not his anger. It was his calm. Naomi did not move as Ethan crossed the living room, his footsteps quiet against the black marble, his attention still partly fixed on the glowing screen in his hand. He typed one last message, slipped the phone into the inside pocket of his coat, and set his keys beside the crystal bowl of orchids as if this were any other night. As if she had not been standing there for hours inside the silence of a marriage slowly freezing from the edges inward. Up close, he looked exactly the way the business magazines liked to photograph him. Immaculate, restrained, untouchable. Not a strand of dark hair out of place. Not a wrinkle in the deep gray suit that had probably cost more than the first month's rent on Naomi's old Brooklyn apartment. Only his eyes betrayed the hour. They carried that faint, glassy fatigue of a man who had been performing certainty for too long. "You are awake," he said at last, his voice low and even, almost gentle if she had not learned how easily gentleness could become distance in the mouth of a powerful man. Naomi gave the smallest nod. I waited. His gaze drifted to the table, the candles, the dinner that had gone cold under silver lids. Something flickered there again, brief and unreadable, then vanished. "You should not have," he replied, loosening his watch and placing it carefully beside the keys. It was a long day. It It was always a long day. Long board meetings. Long negotiations. Long flights. Long silences. Naomi had once admired the discipline in him, the way he moved through pressure without ever seeming hurried. But lately his control had begun to feel like a locked door, polished so beautifully that no one noticed it was never open. "Ethan," she said, and his name settled between them with more intimacy than anything else in the room. He looked at her fully then, finally taking in the nightdress, the note in her hand, the expression she could no longer soften for his comfort. "What is this?" he asked. The question might have sounded careless to anyone else. To Naomi, it sounded like strategy. He was assessing the room the way he assessed risk, locating exits before emotion could touch him. "This is me trying one last time to speak to my husband before he disappears behind another excuse." The words were calm, almost elegant in their restraint, and that restraint surprised even her. Ethan exhaled through his nose, not annoyed exactly, but inconvenienced. He removed his overcoat and laid it over the back of a chair with deliberate precision. "Naomi, it is nearly midnight." "Yes," she said softly. "It is." A quiet settled over them, but this one was different from the others. This silence had edges. It pressed against the chandelier light, against the candles, against the city beyond the glass. Ethan straightened and reached for the water decanter, pouring himself a drink without asking whether she wanted one. The gesture was small, familiar, and somehow more revealing than cruelty would have been. It said he had already left parts of this marriage, before either of them admitted it aloud. Naomi watched the reflection of his hand in the marble counter, steady and elegant and cold. "Are you seeing someone?" she asked. He did not drop the glass. He did not turn sharply or pretend outrage. He simply lifted the tumbler, took one measured sip, and looked at her over the rim with the same unreadable calm he wore in interviews when reporters asked dangerous questions. "You are tired," he said, "and you are imagining things that do not help either of us." Naomi felt something inside her go still. Not broken, not shattered. Still, because the lie was worse than anger, worse than confession. It was refusal with perfect manners. She lowered the note in her hand and realized she would not need it after all. The man standing across from her was not preparing to tell the truth. He was preparing to manage her. And somewhere beneath the chandelier glow and the dying candles, Naomi began to understand that the end of love did not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it arrived in a perfectly tailored suit and asked you to doubt what your own heart had already seen. For the first time that night, Ethan's expression changed. It was slight, almost invisible, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, a stillness that would have meant nothing to anyone who did not know him the way Naomi did. But Naomi had spent 4 years learning the language of his silence. She knew which pause meant irritation, which one meant calculation, and which one meant he had heard the truth and did not like that it had reached the room before he could control it. He set the glass down on the marble counter with a care that felt more dangerous than force ever could. "I am not doing this with you tonight," he said. His tone remained smooth, but the softness was gone now. It had flattened into something colder, executive, final. Naomi folded the note in her hand once, then again, until the paper became a thin white line between her fingers. "Doing what?" she asked, asking a direct question. Ethan turned toward her fully, his posture straight and immaculate beneath the chandelier light. "Creating drama out of exhaustion and insecurity." The words landed. Quietly, but they landed where he intended. Naomi felt the sting of them, not because she believed them, but because once, long ago, he would have protected her from that kind of cruelty instead of shaping it himself. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man whose face still carried the architecture of the one she had loved. The same strong jaw, the same composed mouth, the same eyes that had once softened whenever they found her in a crowded room. But warmth had become strategy in him. Even now, he was not trying to understand her. He was trying to lower her confidence until she questioned what she knew. "I saw the message on your tablet last week," Naomi said, her voice so calm it startled even her. "I did not go looking for it. It lit up while I was handing it to the driver. Dinner tomorrow? Same sweet as last time." And then a heart. Ethan did not blink. "You should not have read something that was not addressed to you." Naomi let out the faintest breath, almost a laugh, except there was no humor in it. "That is your answer?" "My answer," he said, "is that you are crossing a line." The room seemed to grow larger around them. the penthouse stretching into polished emptiness. Outside, a helicopter moved through the distance above the East River, its blinking lights small and temporary against the dark. Naomi thought of all the evenings she had spent defending Ethan to people who found him intimidating, all the times she had translated his coldness into stress, his absence into pressure, his silence into love expressed badly. She had made kindness out of every sharp edge he gave her. She could not do it anymore. No, she said softly. The line was crossed long before tonight. Ethan's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, not enough to intimidate, only enough to remind her how used he was to controlling space when conversation failed him. Be careful, Naomi. There it was. Not volume, not rage. Just a warning delivered in the same voice he used when discussing acquisitions and lawsuits and men who underestimated him. Careful of what? She asked. Of forcing a situation you do not fully understand. He held her gaze, and the chill in his composure finally showed its hand. You live in this home, where what you want, support the causes you care about, move through this city with my name opening doors. Do not make the mistake of turning a private disappointment into a public problem. It would not end well for you. The words hung in the candlelight like frost. Naomi did not move. Somewhere behind her ribs, something ancient and female and exhausted rose to its feet. So this was what remained at the center of his beautiful control. Not remorse. Not even honesty. Power. He thought the greater fortune decided the greater truth. He thought his money could frame the story, soften the betrayal, turn her into an unstable footnote in the life he intended to keep immaculate. Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, and the last illusion fell away without noise. The man before her was not merely unfaithful. He was willing to threaten the woman who had loved him with grace when grace was no longer convenient. Her fingers relaxed around the folded note. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, and clear enough to cut glass. Then keep the apartment, Ethan. Keep the headlines, the boardrooms, the carefully polished image. Keep every expensive thing that taught you to confuse possession with loyalty. She lifted her chin, and something in her eyes changed, something calm and irreversible. But you do not get to keep my dignity. For a moment, the room forgot how to breathe. Ethan stood motionless beside the marble counter, one hand resting near the untouched glass of water, as if he had not expected resistance to sound so quiet. Naomi could see the shift happen behind his eyes, the subtle recalculation of a man who had built his life on leverage and was suddenly faced with something he could not price, could not threaten, could not bend. The candles on the dining table had burned lower now, their soft flames reflecting against the dark windows until the city looked like it was watching them back. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She simply held his gaze with a calm that felt unfamiliar even to her, because it had not been born from certainty. It had been born from the moment certainty finally died. Ethan drew in a measured breath and straightened his cuffs, a habit he returned to whenever emotion came too close. You are being reckless, he said. No, Ethan, Naomi answered. I am being clear. He looked at her the way he looked at market volatility, as if there had to be an angle he had not yet accounted for. You are upset. I understand that. But leaving in the middle of the night because of a misunderstanding is not clarity. It is impulse. Naomi almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. He was still trying to rename reality until it sounded harmless. He had always been good with language. Good at replacing abandonment with pressure, betrayal with complexity, control with protection. It was one of the reasons the world trusted him so easily. He could make the ugliest thing sound disciplined. But there are moments in a woman's life when the truth becomes too sharp to be softened by vocabulary, and Naomi had reached one of them. She walked slowly to the dining table and placed the folded note beside the silverware he had never touched. The paper looked small beneath the chandelier light, almost fragile, but she no longer felt fragile. I spent weeks telling myself there had to be another explanation, she said. I defended your distance. I excused your silence. I blamed stress, your schedule, the pressure of being you. I did all the work of loving you while you did all the work of disappearing. Ethan's face hardened by degrees. Not openly, not enough for anyone else to call him angry, but Naomi saw it. The cooling of his expression, the retreat into polish. That is unfair. No, she said quietly. Unfair is making me feel small for noticing I have been left alone inside my own marriage. For the first time, he looked away, only for a second, toward the city, toward the fire behind the glass, toward anything that did not demand honesty from him. And in that second, Naomi understood something else. He was not wounded by the possibility of losing her. He was unsettled by losing control of the narrative. That realization did not break her. It freed her. She reached for her wedding ring, the platinum band she had worn. So long it had become part of the shape of her hand. Ethan noticed the movement immediately. His eyes flicked back to her, sharper now. Naomi. Just her name. Nothing more. But the warning was there again. Thinner this time, less certain. Naomi slid the ring from her finger with slow, steady care. The skin beneath it was pale, as if the promise had been sheltering a part of her from the light. For one suspended second she held it in her palm, feeling its familiar weight, remembering vows spoken under candlelight in a chapel upstate, remembering laughter on a rain-polished honeymoon veranda in Maine, remembering the first apartment with mismatched dishes and cheap curtains and a kind of hope that had once felt indestructible. Then she crossed to the black marble console by the elevator and set the ring down beside his keys. The sound was small, barely more than a click, but it moved through the penthouse like a verdict. Ethan stared at the ring as if it were the first thing in the room that had spoken plainly all night. Naomi turned away before he could shape another argument, another warning, another elegant distortion. She walked toward the hallway that led to their bedroom, not to reconsider, but to gather the few things she would allow herself to take. Behind her, the candles kept burning. The dinner kept cooling. And for the first time in years, the silence inside that beautiful apartment no longer belonged to him. Naomi closed the bedroom door behind her with a hand that did not shake until it touched the brass handle. Then even that tremor passed. The room looked exactly as it had an hour earlier, immaculate and curated, and filled with the kind of luxury magazines called effortless. Her side of the bed remained perfectly turned down. Ethan's lamp still glowed amber against the upholstered wall. A cashmere throw lay folded across the footboard in a shade of cream, so soft it almost disappeared into the linen. Every object in the room seemed to belong to a life that had already ended. Naomi crossed to the dressing room and pulled a small leather weekender from the top shelf, the one she usually used for charity weekends in the Hamptons or quiet visits to her mother in Connecticut. Tonight it looked different in her hands, less like luggage, more like a witness. She set it on the velvet bench and began to pack with the kind of stillness that comes when grief has moved beyond tears and become instruction. One black sweater, one pair of dark jeans, two blouses, toiletries, her passport, the slim folder containing her personal documents. She left the jewelry boxes untouched, left the designer coats lined up by season, left the handbags Ethan had bought after business trips, each one chosen with the polished intuition of a man who knew how to purchase beauty without understanding what beauty needed to survive. Naomi opened the top drawer of her dresser and paused over a framed photograph tucked beside silk scarves. It had been taken in Maine during their second summer together. Ethan was laughing into the wind on a dock at sunrise, his hand stretched back toward her just outside the frame. She remembered that morning with painful clarity, the smell of salt, the paper cups of coffee warming their hands, the way he had looked at her then as if success meant nothing if she was not there to see it. Naomi traced the edge of the frame once, then placed it face down in the drawer and closed it. Some memories deserved dignity too. Her phone buzzed on the vanity. One message from Claire, her oldest friend, sent nearly an hour ago. Checking in. Are you awake? Naomi stared at the screen for a second, then typed with steady fingers. I need a place for the night. Claire's response came almost immediately. Come now. No questions. The simple mercy of that nearly undid her, but Naomi inhaled slowly and slipped the phone into her bag. In the bathroom, she removed the earrings she had put on for a dinner that never happened and set them beside the sink. She washed her face, not because she had been crying, but because she wanted nothing of this night left on her skin except the truth. When she looked up, her reflection held her gaze with a composure that felt newly earned. The midnight blue silk still fell softly around her, a reminder of what she had expected the evening to be. Naomi studied it for one long second, then reached for the ivory robe hanging behind the door and wrapped it around herself. Not to hide, to leave on her own terms. When she returned to the bedroom, The weekender was full but light. That felt right. She was not taking pieces of his world. She was taking only what belonged to her. As she stepped into the hallway, she could hear nothing from the living room. No footsteps. No apology. No second attempt at power disguised as reason. Only silence, stretched thin and expensive through the penthouse like polished glass. Naomi walked toward the elevator with her bag in one hand and her spine straight. Ethan was standing near the windows when she emerged, his outline cut against the city lights. He had not moved the ring from the marble console. He had not touched the dinner. He turned as she approached, and for the first time that night, there was something uncertain in his expression, not sorrow exactly, but the dawning discomfort of a man realizing his authority had reached its limit. His gaze dropped to the bag, then rose to her face. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. Naomi stopped beside the console, close enough to smell the clean cedar note of his cologne, close enough to remember every better version of him she had once loved. Then she looked at the ring lying beside his keys, cold beneath the chandelier light, and something inside her settled into place with final grace. "No," she said, her voice calm as winter sunlight. "I made one when I kept hoping you would become the man you pretended to be." And with that, she pressed the elevator button, watched the door slide open in a wash of soft gold, and stepped inside without looking back. The elevator doors closed with a whisper so soft it almost felt respectful, as if even the building understood that some exits deserved silence. Naomi stood alone beneath the muted gold light, one hand wrapped around the handle of her weekender, the other resting lightly against the cool mirrored wall as the penthouse level disappeared above her. She expected to feel panic somewhere between the 47th floor and the lobby. She expected grief to arrive like a wave, sharp and theatrical and impossible to hide. Instead, what came was something quieter, a strange, clean emptiness. Not relief exactly. Not yet. Just the absence of negotiation. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she was not arranging herself around Ethan's moods, his schedule, his silence, his version of reality. The lobby was nearly still when she stepped out just after midnight. A fountain murmured beneath a suspended sculpture of blown glass. The marble floor held the reflection of recessed lights in long silver bands. Behind the front desk, the overnight concierge looked up with practiced warmth that quickly shifted into careful discretion when he saw the bag in her hand and the robe belted neatly over her nightdress. In Manhattan, wealth taught people many things. One of them was when not to ask questions. Naomi offered a small nod and crossed toward the revolving doors. Outside, the city had thinned but not slept. A black car moved past in a wash of light. Steam rose from a street grate near the curb. Somewhere downtown, a siren carried through the night and faded into distance. Claire lived on the Upper West Side in a pre-war building with crown molding, overwatered plants, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee no matter the hour. Naomi had spent enough late evenings there to know the rhythm of the place, the slow elevator, the brass mailboxes, the doorman who called everyone by name like he had known them in another life. She called a car from the curb and watched the app confirm the driver's arrival in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. It struck her then how quickly a life could split into before and after, not because of one grand betrayal alone, but because of the moment a woman finally stopped explaining away what should never have been asked of her. The car arrived, and Naomi slid into the back seat, giving Claire's address in a voice that sounded calm even to her own ears. As the driver pulled away from the curb, the glass tower that held the Callaway penthouse receded in the rear window, all steel and light and polished indifference. Naomi looked at it until traffic turned and the building vanished behind another row of illuminated facades. She thought she might cry then. She did not. Instead, she leaned her head lightly against the seat and stared out at the sleeping storefronts, the late diners under fluorescent glow, the delivery cyclist coasting through an empty intersection, the woman in running shoes waiting for a walk signal with a bouquet tucked under one arm. The city did not pause for heartbreak. It never had. There was something almost comforting in that. Claire opened the apartment door before Naomi could knock twice. She was wearing gray lounge pants, an old Yale sweatshirt, and the expression of someone prepared to fight on behalf of a friend before hearing a single detail. But when she saw Naomi standing there in the ivory robe, the small bag, The composed face that looked far too calm for midnight. All that fierce energy softened into something gentler. "Come in," she said quietly. Naomi stepped inside, and warmth met her at once. Lamplight, books stacked on a side table, the low hum of jazz from the kitchen speaker, a mug already waiting beside the kettle, as if Claire had somehow known this night would require tea instead of questions. Naomi set her bag by the door and finally exhaled all the air she had been carrying since the penthouse. Claire did not ask what happened. She simply drew Naomi into a long, steady embrace, the kind that does not demand composure and does not fear silence. For one fragile second, Naomi let herself rest there. Then she stepped back, smoothing the belt of her robe with careful fingers. "I left," she said. The words sounded simple, almost plain, but they changed the room the moment they were spoken. Claire studied her face, saw more than Naomi wanted to explain, and nodded once. "Then you did the right thing." Later, after tea had cooled on the coffee table and the guest room lamp had been switched on, Naomi stood alone by the small window overlooking Riverside Drive. Below, the traffic lights blinked through the darkness like patient signals. Behind her, Claire had laid out a soft cotton set of pajamas and a clean towel on the bed without ceremony. Such tenderness, Naomi thought, was the opposite of power plays. It did not dominate. It restored. Naomi touched the window glass with her fingertips and saw her own reflection layered over the city, a woman wrapped in borrowed quiet, carrying no ring, no certainty, no plan beyond mourning. And yet beneath the ache, beneath the humiliation, beneath the long shock of finally choosing herself, something else had begun to stir. It was small, barely there, but it was alive. Not vengeance, not even hope. Just the first hard glint of a future that no longer depended on being loved badly. Morning arrived without mercy, but it arrived with structure, and Naomi discovered that structure could be a kind of salvation. Claire's apartment was quiet at 6:30, the city outside still washed in that pale gray light that made Manhattan look less like a kingdom and more like a place where ordinary people simply tried again. Naomi had not slept much. She had drifted in and out beneath the soft cotton sheets of the guest room, waking each time the silence changed shape around her. Once to the distant hum of a garbage truck, once to the radiator clicking in the hallway, once to the sudden memory of Ethan standing by the window, beautiful and cold, while her ring lay beside his keys like a closing statement. But by morning the ache had sharpened into something useful. It no longer felt like collapse. It felt like instruction. She rose before Claire did, folded the borrowed pajamas neatly on the end of the bed, and tied her hair back with a simple black ribbon she found in her weekender. In the guest bathroom, she washed her face, applied a light layer of moisturizer, and studied herself in the mirror. The woman reflected there looked tired, yes, but not diminished. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. The softness was still there, but something stronger had taken root beneath it, something steady and unsentimental. Naomi had spent too long confusing endurance with love. This morning, she began learning the difference. Claire found her in the kitchen standing beside the coffee maker in one of Claire's cream sweaters and dark leggings, a mug warming both hands. "You should be in bed," Claire said gently. Naomi gave a faint smile. "If I stay still too long, I will start thinking in circles." Claire did not argue. She only opened the refrigerator, pulled out eggs and berries, and moved through the kitchen with the practical grace of someone who understood that care often looked like routine. "Then we build a plan before your thoughts can do that," she said. Plan. The word landed with surprising comfort. Naomi had always been good with plans. Before marriage had turned her life into an orbit around someone else's priorities, she had been known for precision, taste, and quiet execution. She had worked in luxury retail branding in her late 20s, helping smaller labels refine their visual identity and customer experience until investors started noticing. She understood fabric, presentation, mood, aspiration. She understood what women reached for when they wanted to feel like themselves again. Somewhere between Ethan's rise and the long erosion of her own voice, she had let those skills sit untouched, polished but unused, like heirloom silver in a locked cabinet. Over breakfast, Claire placed a legal pad between them and uncapped a pen. "First," she said, "where will you stay after this?" Naomi stared at the blank page for a moment. Then she answered with more certainty than she expected. "Not with my mother. She will love me too loudly, and right now I need quiet. Claire nodded and wrote. Temporary apartment. Furnished. Month to month. Second, Claire continued. What do you need from the penthouse? Naomi looked down at the coffee in her cup, watching the dark surface tremble once before settling. Nothing I cannot replace. The words surprised her with how true they felt. There had been a time when that apartment represented a rival. Now it felt like a museum dedicated to how completely a beautiful life could betray itself. Claire studied her face, then nodded again, understanding the sentence Naomi had not spoken aloud. The things that mattered had never been kept in the closets. By 9 o'clock, Naomi had called a discreet broker Claire trusted and secured a furnished one-bedroom in Tribeca for immediate occupancy. It was smaller than the penthouse, of course, but it had tall windows, good light, and a kitchen lined in pale oak. The broker described it as elegant. Without trying too hard, Naomi liked that immediately. She also emailed a family attorney Claire recommended, requesting a consultation before noon. Not because she wanted war, because she refused to walk unprepared into the next chapter of a story Ethan would likely try to control. By late morning, after Claire left for a meeting downtown, Naomi sat alone at the small walnut desk by the window with a fresh notebook open in front of her. For a few minutes, she simply stared at the blank page, listening to the muted traffic below. Then she wrote a single phrase across the top in neat, deliberate script. What can I build from this? She had expected the question to feel desperate. Instead, it felt electric. Images began arriving almost at once. Silk in darker shades, clean lines, sleepwear that did not whisper submission but restoration. Pieces designed for women rebuilding themselves behind closed doors before the world ever saw them rise. Naomi looked at the words on the page and felt something shift with quiet force. Ethan had believed the symbols of her softness made her weak. He had never understood that softness, when betrayed deeply enough, could become design, could become language, could become empire. And as the winter light moved across the notebook and settled over her hand, Naomi Brooks began sketching the first outlines of a future shaped not by what had been taken from her, but by what she had finally stopped giving away. 3 years later, the city still knew how to dress itself for spectacle. On the first Thursday in October, the Grand Astor Hotel rose above Midtown in a wash of amber light, its limestone facade glowing against the early evening sky, while black cars lined the curb in polished procession. Inside, the annual Mercer Foundation Gala unfolded with the familiar language of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers, white peonies, string music suspended beneath conversation, and the soft metallic flash of cameras eager to capture power dressed as grace. But this year, the name moving quietly through every private exchange was not Ethan Callaway's. It was Naomi Brooks. At precisely 7:40, a murmur began near the ballroom entrance and traveled through the room with the elegant speed of a secret becoming fact. Naomi stepped inside wearing a black silk gown cut with the kind of restraint that made it unforgettable. Long sleeves, clean neckline, a silhouette so precise it looked less like fashion and more like intention. Her hair fell in soft, controlled waves over one shoulder. Diamond studs caught the chandelier light without competing with it. She did not arrive searching for attention. That was why the room gave it to her. 3 years had refined her into something impossible to ignore. The woman who had once stood waiting in a penthouse wrapped in hope now crossed the ballroom with the stillness of someone who had built herself back from silence and did not need anyone in the room to validate the result. Around her, conversations shifted. The founder of Nocturne House, someone whispered near the bar. The sleepwear brand. The one every editor is covering. The one Saks expanded last quarter. The one Vogue called emotional luxury for the post-collapse woman. Naomi heard none of it clearly, and that too was part of her transformation. Success had taught her the discipline of selective hearing. She knew the numbers, of course. The flagship in Soho profitable within 14 months. The second line carried by major department stores by year 2. The philanthropic partnership with women's transitional housing centers that had made buyers admire her for reasons deeper than aesthetics. But what mattered most to Naomi had never fit into headlines. She had built a world from the very symbols once used to diminish her. Silk had become language. Nightwear had become armor. Restoration had become business. On the far side of the ballroom, Ethan Calloway stood beside a group of investors beneath a cascade of candlelight, one hand in his tuxedo pocket, his expression composed in the old familiar way that had once made entire rooms rearrange themselves around his approval. He had not planned to come tonight, not until a board member insisted it would be politically useful. He had agreed because usefulness was a language he still trusted. What he had not expected was to look up from a polite conversation about venture funds and see Naomi Brooks descending the curved staircase like the final answer to a question he had spent 3 years trying not to ask. He went still. Not visibly, not enough for anyone except someone who knew him intimately to notice, but the stillness was there. His glass remained lifted halfway to his mouth. The investor speaking beside him faded into abstraction. All Ethan could see was Naomi in black silk beneath the chandeliers, surrounded not by pity, not by gossip, but by the quiet gravity of earned regard. There was no trace of the woman he had once believed would fracture under pressure. In her place stood someone sharper, calmer, and infinitely more dangerous to his memory, because she looked whole. The woman beside Ethan, a venture philanthropist from Boston whose name he had already forgotten, followed his gaze and smiled politely. "That is Naomi Brooks," she said. "I met her this spring. She is extraordinary." Ethan did not answer. Extraordinary. The word should have felt insufficient. Yet hearing it from someone else made something cold move through him. He watched as Naomi paused to greet a senator's wife, then a magazine editor, then the founder of a clean beauty company, now hoping to collaborate with Nocturne House on a holiday campaign. She belonged here in a way even money could not manufacture. She belonged because she had suffered, rebuilt, refined, and returned without begging the world to remember who she was. Across the ballroom, Naomi accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and turned slightly toward the mirrored wall, where the chandeliers multiplied themselves into endless ribbons of light. For half a second she saw Ethan's reflection behind her. Tall, controlled, watching. The old Naomi might have felt her pulse break stride. This Naomi only noticed, then breathed. She did not turn immediately. She let the moment rest where it was, because power, she had learned, often lived in refusing to rush toward what once wounded you. When she finally faced him, it was not with anger. It was with calm recognition, the kind one offers a closed chapter that shaped the book but no longer owns it. Their eyes met. Across 30 feet of polished floor and candlelit distance. Ethan saw no plea there. No softness asking to be chosen. Only elegance, memory, and a dignity so complete it exposed the poverty of every threat he had ever made. And standing beneath the gold and crystal of a room built to celebrate legacy, Ethan Calloway understood with brutal clarity that Naomi had done more than survive the night he tried to contain her. She had turned it into an empire, and tonight the whole city was applauding. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The music continued somewhere near the stage, a violin carrying something soft and expensive through the ballroom. But around Naomi and Ethan the air seemed to hold its breath. She stood with one hand lightly curved around the stem of her glass, black silk falling in clean lines to the floor, while he remained near the investors and candlelight, looking at her as though the last 3 years had collapsed into one unbearable second. Naomi had imagined this moment once, in the early months after she left, when pain still woke beside her and every memory arrived with sharp edges. Back then she thought reunion might feel like vindication, like thunder, like watching a ruined man finally understand what he had broken. But healing had changed the architecture of her heart. Now, standing beneath crystal light with a company she had built from discipline and sorrow and taste, she felt no hunger for spectacle. She felt only clarity. Ethan crossed the ballroom slowly, offering absent apologies to the people he passed. Those nearest to them sensed something intimate in the air and looked away with polished discretion. By the time he stopped in front of her, the cameras had turned toward the stage and the room had resumed its elegant pulse. Up close, he looked older than he had 3 years ago. Not dramatically, just enough for the truth to show. Fine lines near the eyes. A fatigue no tailor could press smooth. He was still handsome, still composed, still carrying that practiced stillness that used to make Naomi mistake containment for character. But tonight there was something else beneath it, something frayed and late. "Naomi," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now. Softer, less certain. She met his gaze with calm courtesy. "Ethan." No accusation. No bitterness. Just recognition. He glanced down at the glass in her hand, at the diamond studs catching light near her throat, at the room that now revolved around her without effort. You look well, he said. Naomi almost smiled. It was such an inadequate sentence for everything standing between them. I am well, she answered. The honesty of it seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He looked at her for another second, then exhaled through his nose as though surrendering to a truth he could no longer outmaneuver. I have followed your work, he said. What you built. It is remarkable. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Thank you. She did not offer him more. Did not rescue the moment from its discomfort. Ethan had once taught her how powerful silence could be when used to dominate. Life had taught her how much more powerful it was when used to reveal. He shifted, one hand brushing the front of his jacket before falling still at his side. There are things I should have said a long time ago. Naomi watched him with serene attention, but nothing inside her leaned forward. He noticed. Of course he noticed. I was cruel, he continued, the words sounding strange on a man long accustomed to speaking in polished abstractions. Not just dishonest. Cruel. I told myself I was protecting what I had built, protecting my name, my company, the life that depended on my judgment. But the truth is simpler than that. I was selfish and arrogant. I thought power would let me define the damage I caused. The violins swelled somewhere behind them. Glasses clinked. A waiter passed carrying silver trays of champagne no one at their distance reached for. Naomi listened without interruption. Once, this confession might have unraveled her. Once, she might have mistaken remorse for repair. But the woman standing here now had paid too much for her clarity to exchange it for nostalgia. Ethan's eyes searched her face, perhaps looking for the version of Naomi who would soften first, who would remember Maine, the early years, the mornings when love had felt simple and mutual. He would not find her. That woman had not died. She had evolved beyond his access. I thought about that night more times than I can count, he said quietly. You leaving. The ring on the marble. The way you looked at me, as if you finally saw me clearly. I do not think I understood loss until then. Naomi let the words settle. They were sincere. She could hear that now. Time had stripped something performative from him. But sincerity was not the same as restoration, and regret was not a bridge back to trust. Ethan, she said, and there was kindness in her voice, which made what came next even truer. I believe you are sorry. His expression shifted with sudden fragile hope, so brief and human it almost hurt to witness. Naomi continued before that hope could turn into expectation. But your apology belongs to the past. I do not live there anymore. He held her gaze, and she watched the meaning reach him in stages. First resistance, then understanding, then the slow, silent ache of a man recognizing that consequences had finally arrived in a form money could not negotiate with. There is no chance for us? He asked. The question was quiet, not entitled, just bare. Naomi looked around the ballroom for a moment, at the women in silk and satin, the waitstaff moving like clockwork, the candlelight multiplying in mirrored walls, the life she had entered tonight not as someone's wife, but as her own name made visible. Then she returned her eyes to his. There was, she said softly, years ago, in the penthouse, at the table I set for you, in every silence where I hoped you would choose honesty before I had to choose myself. She paused, and the pause itself became mercy. You did not. Ethan lowered his gaze. The admission landed exactly where it should. Naomi could have left then, and part of her knew that would have been the cleanest ending. But dignity, she had learned, was not cold. It was precise. She touched his forearm lightly, a gesture not of reunion, but of release. I do forgive you, she said. His eyes lifted, startled. Naomi's own were steady, clear, almost luminous beneath the chandelier glow. Not because what you did was small. Because I refused to carry it any longer. I built too beautiful a life to let its foundation remain your worst mistake. Something in his face broke then, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough. Enough for the truth to show. Naomi stepped back with the same calm grace she had brought into the room. Take care of the man you become next, she said. I already survived the man you were. Then she turned, black silk gliding through candlelight, and crossed the ballroom toward the stage where the foundation chair was waiting to introduce her. Halfway there, the room began to applaud as her name was announced over the sound system, warm and certain and entirely her own. Naomi did not look back. She had done that once already, on a night when her heart was breaking and an elevator carried her away from everything she thought she needed. This time she walked forward beneath crystal light with her heart intact, her voice ready, and the whole city rising to its feet for a woman who had not merely left. She had returned as the author of her own ending.